Chris had always been the healthy one. It's why, when we left the diner that night, I didn't think much of it when he complained about a headache. We'd spent hours reminiscing about the past, future plans that were more daydreams than reality, and the smell of stale coffee still lingered in my clothes. That small, dimly lit diner was our usual haunt, a place frozen in time, the type of establishment where conversations about nothing became everything. The town was quieter than usual that night. Not the calm, peaceful kind of quiet, but the eerie, suffocating silence that felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. The air itself felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Chris slowed down. "You all right?" I asked, only half joking, expecting him to complain about greasy food. But his face had paled, a waxy sheen under the dim streetlight. He didn't answer. Instead, he clutched his stomach and stumbled against a lamppost. I'd never seen Chris like this clammy, his breathing ragged. Panic clawed at me. This was more than just bad food. "Come on, man. Let's get you to the hospital," I muttered, trying to keep my voice calm even though fear had already started to tighten around my chest. He was barely conscious as I loaded him into my car, his head slumping against the window, and his breath growing fainter with each passing second. My foot hit the gas hard. The streets, normally quiet, now felt desolate, lifeless. The blue glow of streetlights blurred as I sped through empty roads, the world outside seeming to melt away into a strange, surreal dream. When the hospital finally loomed ahead, a cold, sterile building standing out against the night, I pulled up sharply at the emergency entrance. Inside, it was even worse. The waiting room felt off. The buzzing fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell, the way the receptionist barely glanced up as if she was used to people arriving at odd hours with dire emergencies. It was as though this place had forgotten how to care. They took Chris quickly. I wasn't allowed to follow, a nurse's hand blocking my path as she gave me a sterile wait here. I sat down, trying to calm the storm in my head. The room was nearly empty except for a few scattered people. The TV flickered silently in the corner, and a tired receptionist typed away at a dusty computer. But there was something about the air, something I couldn't shake. It felt thick, as if time itself was dragging. That's when I found the list. It had been shoved into the chair beside me, old and crumpled. The handwriting was messy, uneven, but the rules written on it chilled me. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. Each rule felt wrong, like it was mocking me. But as I read on, the unease settled deeper into my bones. If a power outage occurs, stay seated and do not move. If a door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and do not look inside. Do not look through the glass doors leading to the courtyard after 4 a.m. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. It's safe to leave after 6 a.m. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky red ink, were the words, "Trust me, I learned the hard way." And there was a dark stain, crusted over, looking far too much like blood. I tried to laugh it off, a joke, surely, a stupid prank. But the atmosphere in the room was heavier now, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in. Then I heard it. Adam ... It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. It was Chris's voice. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, but then it came again, louder, desperate. "Adam, help me." Without thinking, I stood. I'd been warned, hadn't I? The list. But how could I just sit there when Chris needed me? The hallway was darker than it should have been. The fluorescent lights flickered, some going out entirely. And as I walked further, the shadows seemed to press in from all sides. My footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. Then I saw something. A figure, no, a mass of dark hair spilling out from a doorway, tangled and unkempt, and a single eye, black as pitch, staring out at me. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then the figure moved, slowly creeping toward me. An arm, long and unnaturally thin, reached out, and as it brushed against my skin, it was ice cold, corpse-like. I ran. The list had warned me, and now I understood. These weren't rules to mock the lost, they were survival instructions. I barely made it back to the waiting room, panting, heart racing. As I collapsed into a chair, I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was spinning, every sound amplified in the sterile silence. I looked at the clock. It was only 1:45 a.m. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw him. A man, tall, lanky, standing at the entrance with his hands in his pockets, scanning the room. His eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long. The list flashed in my mind: do not help anyone who asks for directions. But it was already too late. As the man stepped closer, my pulse quickened. His face was obscured by the dim lighting, but there was something unnatural about his movements, stiff yet fluid, like a predator stalking prey. My fingers tightened around the armrests of the plastic chair, a nervous habit, but this time, I was hanging on for dear life. He was coming straight for me. "Excuse me," he said, voice smooth as glass, but there was an edge to it, like nails on a chalkboard. "Can you tell me where the emergency room is?" I didn't answer, but the words from the list rang in my head, louder now, each one a warning: do not help anyone who asks for directions. My heart pounded in my ears. The man stepped closer, his form towering over me. His shoes scraped against the floor with an unpleasant, grating sound, like something being dragged against concrete. I glanced up, regretting it immediately. His face ... it wasn't right. His eyes were too wide, unblinking, and his mouth curled into a smile that stretched too far across his cheeks, like his skin was being pulled by invisible strings. A part of me wanted to bolt, to run as far away as possible, but I was frozen, rooted to the chair as if invisible hands were holding me down. The man leaned in closer, his breath cold against my face. "I asked you a question." I forced myself to look away, clenching my jaw, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't a person. It couldn't be. I had to keep my eyes on the floor, just like the list had instructed. But every second felt like a lifetime. The air around me thickened, pressing down like a vice. His presence felt overwhelming, suffocating. "You don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice dripping with something dark, something dangerous. He took a step back, his body flickering, just for a moment, like a bad signal on a TV screen. My breath hitched in my throat. He wasn't real. Or at least, he wasn't human. Before I could react, the man turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, but the cold sweat on my skin reminded me of the danger I was still in. I glanced back at the clock. To 05 a.m. I had to make it to 6. That's when the lights began to flicker again. The waiting room dipped in and out of darkness, and each time the light disappeared, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more hostile. I could feel eyes watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The buzzing of the overhead lights became erratic, and with each flicker, I swore I saw movement in the corners of the room. Shadowy figures, crawling along the walls, too fast to make out, but enough to send chills down my spine. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, counting the seconds until the light would return ... But then the power cut out entirely. Complete darkness swallowed the room, and with it, a silence so deep it felt alive. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of something waiting, watching. I remembered the list: if a power outage occurs, stay seated and do not move. But it was hard. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness felt like it was breathing, closing in on me from all sides. I gripped the chair harder, my knuckles white. Then I heard the sound of shuffling, faint at first, like something dragging itself across the floor. My heart raced, pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. The sound grew louder, closer. My breath hitched as I held myself perfectly still, every muscle in my body tensing, fighting the urge to look around. The sound stopped right behind me. Something cold, unnaturally cold, brushed against my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, clenching my teeth to stop from screaming. There was a soft, wet sound like something exhaling in my ear, too close, far too close. "Why didn't you help him?" the voice whispered, barely more than a breath. It was the same man from before, but this time, his voice was different, lower, rougher, filled with malice. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but the list had been clear: stay seated and do not move. So I didn't. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. The cold presence hovered behind me, waiting, as if daring me to break the rule. Every second stretched unbearably long, and I could feel my sanity slipping, teetering on the edge. But I held on. Somehow, I held on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back on, casting their harsh fluorescent glow over the room. The presence was gone. The shadows retreated to the corners of the room, but I could still feel their eyes on me. I looked at the clock again. 3 a.m. There were still 3 more hours until dawn. The hospital had transformed into something else by then. The once sterile hallways now seemed like an endless labyrinth of corridors, twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. Every now and then, I heard Chris's voice calling out, but I didn't dare follow it. I couldn't trust anything in this place, not anymore. At 4 a.m., the glass doors leading to the courtyard began to rattle. The list's warning rang in my head: do not look through the glass doors leading to the courtyard. After 4 a.m. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look. But the rattling grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to force its way inside. My heartbeat quickened, and sweat dripped down my forehead. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I could feel something standing on the other side of the door, watching, waiting for me to slip. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I remained glued to my seat. And then I heard a soft tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, almost polite, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. My breathing became shallow, my body trembling with the effort to remain still. The tapping continued, methodical and unrelenting, testing my resolve. I clenched my fists, refusing to open my eyes, refusing to look. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. I exhaled shakily, my body still tense. The room fell into an oppressive silence once more, broken only by the occasional buzz of the lights. Time dragged on. Minutes felt like hours. And then, finally, mercifully, the clock struck 6 a.m. I glanced around the room, the tension slowly easing from my body. The receptionist was back at her desk, typing away like nothing had happened. The shadows had retreated to wherever they had come from. The hospital, as strange as it was, seemed normal again, but Chris was still missing. I stood up, my legs weak, and made my way to the front desk. The receptionist didn't even glance up. "Can I see my friend?" I asked, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. She finally looked up, her eyes cold and indifferent. "There's no one here by that name." I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to protest, to explain that he had been brought in hours ago, that he was sick. But she just shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No one came in tonight," she said flatly. As I walked out of the hospital, the early morning sun rising over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. The shadows still felt too close, the world still too quiet. And as I glanced back at the hospital, the lights flickered once more. I never saw Chris again. But every now and then, late at night, I hear a faint tapping at my window, and I wonder if I've really escaped. As the days passed, the events at the hospital gnawed at my mind like a festering wound. The rational part of me tried to chalk it up to stress, exhaustion, or perhaps even a vivid nightmare. But every time I convinced myself of that, I would hear that sound again: tap, tap, tap on my bedroom window. Soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby pulling me toward something dark. I hadn't told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? Chris was gone, vanished into thin air. His family never found him, and the hospital insisted they had no records of his visit. It was as if he had never existed, but I knew better. The tapping continued, and each night it grew more insistent, more demanding. I tried ignoring it, burying my head under the covers, telling myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The hospital had let something out that night, something that wasn't meant to walk in the world of the living. One evening, weeks after the incident, I couldn't take it anymore. The tapping was relentless, growing louder, faster, as if whatever was out there was trying to claw its way in. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled as I stood by the window, paralyzed with dread. It was 3 a.m. I tried to remember the rules, the ones from that horrible list. I shouldn't look. I shouldn't acknowledge it. But this wasn't the hospital. This was my home. The rules couldn't apply here, could they? I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the window, the glass fogging slightly from my breath. The tapping continued, faster now, almost frantic, and then it stopped. The sudden silence was suffocating. My skin prickled with the cold realization that whatever was out there wasn't going to give up. Without thinking, I moved toward the window, as if drawn by an invisible force. My hand shook as I reached for the curtains. I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to run, to hide. But I didn't. I pulled the curtains back. At first, I saw nothing, just the quiet street outside, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The wind rustled the leaves, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But then I saw it, a face pressed against the glass. Pale to pale, with sunken eyes and a smile that stretched too far, too wide, as if someone had carved it into the skin. The same face from the hospital, the same unblinking eyes that had asked me for directions. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The thing outside didn't move. It just watched me, its smile widening, splitting the skin of its cheeks even further, revealing something dark and wet beneath. The tapping started again, this time from inside the house. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. There, standing in the hallway, was Chris, but it wasn't really him. His skin was sallow, his clothes torn and dirty, and his eyes, those lifeless, hollow eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. He raised his hand, tapping his fingers rhythmically against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. "Why didn't you help me?" he rasped, his voice low, filled with pain and accusation. His figure flickered, just like the man in the hospital had, like a bad signal on an old television. He took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away, my legs trembling, my back hitting the wall. "Chris," I whispered, barely able to speak through the terror constricting my throat. "I tried. You left me," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. His face twisted into something grotesque, something wrong. "You let them take me." I wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, I hadn't been able to save him. I hadn't been able to save myself. The list, the warnings, they had kept me alive, but at what cost? Chris took another step, his body flickering again, and the air around me grew cold, freezing cold. My breath came out in shallow, panic gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. He smiled a twisted, horrible smile. Too late. The lights in the room flickered violently, and the shadows seemed to swell, consuming everything around me. I stumbled forward, trying to reach for the door, for any escape, but the cold enveloped me, dragging me down into the darkness. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the soft, relentless tapping. When I woke up, I was back in the hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. I blinked, my head throbbing as I sat up in the hospital bed. My body ached, and my throat was dry, but I was alive. The same receptionist sat behind the desk, typing away. The waiting room looked exactly as it had that night, as if nothing had changed. I looked around frantically. "Chris." I called out, my voice raw, desperate, but there was no answer. No sign of him, no sign of anything strange at all. Had it all been a nightmare? I got out of bed, my legs shaky as I approached the receptionist. She glanced up at me, her face blank, her eyes cold. "Your friend didn't make it," she said flatly. I opened my mouth to protest, to scream, but the words died in my throat. I stumbled back, my head spinning, the list, the rules. The strange occurrences, they weren't just part of the hospital. They followed me here, they followed me home. And as I looked back at the hospital entrance, the glass doors rattled once again, just like they had that night. Tap, tap, tap. I had never escaped, and I never would. The tapping continues. It always does. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it finds me. Sometimes it's at my window, sometimes it's at my door, sometimes it's inside, closer than I ever want it to be. But the worst part is, I'm starting to think that maybe it's not just Chris. Maybe they're all coming for me now. One by one, and soon, they'll tap for you too.